Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William B., Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, Sarah, William H., Augustus, Keanu, and Judy at the Alexandria level, Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, and Steve, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level, and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Leonard the Great, Alex the Great, and Amma the Great. With that, I hope you enjoy this next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Welcome back, everyone. In the next 2 episodes, we will have a special guest, Glenn Amorosia. Glenn has joined us before to talk about papal encyclicals, particularly one of Pope Francis's more recent encyclicals, Fratelli, Tutti. That episode is a great introduction to the genre of papal encyclicals. In today's episode, Glenn is going to lead us through some of the most important documents and encyclicals of the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, Glenn and I recorded this episode quite some time ago, probably around 2 years ago. I have to give Glenn a great deal of credit in giving me the idea to make this entire series on Pope Pius IX and the end of the medieval papacy. I'm very thankful to Glenn for creating the spark of the idea for this series. I don't know if this is my best series, I'll leave that for you to judge, but I know it is definitely my favorite. Since we recorded this episode a while ago, the audio's a bit dodgy in spots. I really can't believe how far remote audio recording has come in just the last 2 years. I guess there is a bright spot in the whole global pandemic thing. Glenn is really a man after my own heart. He was interested in papal encyclicals, so he dove in, researched them, and wrote a book about them. He also produced an episode of the History of the Papacy in 10 Minutes YouTube channel on Catholic monk and theologian Thomas Merton. You can find a link to that episode in the show notes, as well as the Fratelli Tutti episode. Now, I asked Glenn if he wanted to plug any of his books or social media or any of that, and he declined. He did ask if I could mention the Adult Congenital Heart Association. Any donation, even $5, would be greatly appreciated. It would be especially appreciated if you could make a donation in the name of Glenn's son, Dale Amorosia, who passed several years ago from a congenital heart defect. Both Glenn and I definitely thank you for listening and your consideration for donating to this worthwhile charity. Links can be found in the show notes. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Welcome back. Today, I'm very excited to speak with Glenn Amorosia, who's the author of the book, The Modern Popes Speak, and it's a book about the encyclicals of the popes from 1870 onward, and we're delving more into modern papal history here, but I think it's going to give us a good idea of where the papacy goes and how it evolves, especially throughout the what we're getting into this the modern period, especially, if we really want to look at the papacy as an institution that grew and changed over the course of 2 millennia. So in order to get started here today, Glenn, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in papal encyclicals and the history of the popes?
Well, thank you, Steve. You're right. My name is Glenn Amorosia, and I have a son who lives in the West Coast and 2 daughters in the Southeast, and my wife and I live in Colorado now, so we have all the time zones covered. I'm retired now. I've worked in human resources. I have a couple degrees in journalism and with a minor in history. So that was really where my interest in history began. I grew up as a Catholic and had an interest in learning about the popes. And as I got more time, I really wanted to start reading the encyclicals of the popes, and I went back to 1878 when Pope Leo XIII took over as pope. And as I started taking notes, I found out in order to keep track of the large number of encyclicals that had been written between 1878 and the current time, what started out as notes turned into being a book.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you took it in that direction. I think it's really fascinating when you get interested in a specific topic like that and then to carry it over into writing a book. That's, it's kind of like a process of starting a podcast or anything. It's a creative outlet to do while you're learning, and it's a great way to learn something new.
And I did learn a lot, and there was quite an evolution in encyclicals. I guess the way to start is probably really to say, what is an encyclical? And really simply put, the word encyclical comes from the Greek derivation is circle, and what it really means is it is a letter that's addressed to all the bishops of the world, so it's circulated among the bishops, and they're usually addressed to I'm quoting, to the patriarch, primates, archbishops, and bishops of the universal church in communion with the apostolic see. So it's a letter that's written to all the bishops around the world. Now, there is some exceptions occasionally, and usually with Leo XIII, back in the later 19th century, he did write a number of encyclicals to the bishops of a single country, and so that would be circulated there. But generally speaking, it's written to the bishops throughout the entire world. Usually the encyclical is there to address the welfare of the church, to condemn prevalent form of errors, to point out dangers against faith or morals, to exhort the faithful to constancy, or to prescribe remedies for evils. And as they evolve, they become kind of like a white paper, or what I would call a white paper, kind of a very thorough discussion of a topic. Now, one comparison people make, or they're probably more familiar, or maybe more familiar with the term of a papal bull. A papal bull, a bulla was originally a circular plate or boss of metal, so called from its resemblance in form to a bubble floating upon the water. But in the course of time, the term came to be applied to the leaden seals with which the papal and royal documents were authenticated in the early Middle Ages. So in essence, a bull was an apostolic letter with a leaden seal. Generally speaking, the papal bull was addressed from this is my Latin, so excuse the pronunciation, Episcopus Servorum Dei, which means the bishop, the servant of servants of God. And so a papal bull really is a document with a leaden seal. It has the seal has the picture of the Pope, usually has the picture of Peter and Paul. There's a wheel or rota with the motto or signum of the Pope in the concentric circle on the outside. There really haven't been many papal bulls written of late since the year 2000. There's only been 2. One in the year 2000, which was from Pope John Paul II, which was on the Great Jubilee of the year 2000. And then in the year 2015, our current Pope, Pope Francis, wrote a bull on the Extraordinary Jubilee of Mercy, which was the year of 2016. So there's really only been two. In contrast, there's probably been about 10 encyclicals written since the year 2000, maybe even a little bit less. But that number has also been coming down. The number of encyclicals, for example, for Pope Leo XIII, who was in the papacy for 25 years, he wrote 90. So you can see that the number have come down. Pius the 12th wrote 45, and that was during the 40s and 50s. So the number of encyclicals has come down. The number of bulls has come drastically down.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Richard Lim's This American President and other great shows. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more, and here is a quick word from our sponsors. So the encyclical, it really ties back to even the earliest days of Christianity, where people like, say, Paul would write a letter to a community addressing a certain issue. And would you say that it fits into that tradition?
I would say part of it does, because the letters that Paul wrote were, of course, addressed to be read out and circulated, but usually that was within one church or within one bishop. The encyclicals do go back a long time, though the prominence is more in modern times. But encyclicals really are meant to go to churches throughout a large area. And like I said, right now, when we speak encyclicals, it's usually to the global church.
And then what would be the technical difference between a bull and an encyclical? Are they addressing different sorts of issues? Do they have a different purpose to them, or a different set of expected outcomes?
Well, they kind of vary. I guess you could probably even have an encyclical with that is a bull also if it had a leaden seal. But generally speaking, I would say a bull is more of a legal document with having that leaden seal. Very often in the Middle Ages or even earlier, bulls were used to convey property, say from the Pope to a monastery or to a seminary. And this kind of led to some fraudulent or spurious bulls where the seminary or monastery might not actually have the document, and they would go out and forge a document or a bull to show that. As opposed to an encyclical. Encyclical does not have the leaden seal, and it is really just a letter.
So let's take a look at this general overview of where encyclicals came from, because there really is, you could say it's a more of a modern invention or innovation of the way that the popes of Rome used the encyclical. Where did that start from?
Well, they really grew into prominence in the mid-1800s. But to understand why that they did become prominent, let me go back about a century earlier to kind of give you a state of the world as far as the church was concerned. And the first and the most prominent thing I think you could say is that Europe was Christian at that time. Even though the Reformation had occurred and there were some countries that were Protestant, really the Catholic Church was the predominant force as far as religions go. And when we say they're predominant, they dominated in the countries like France and Spain and Portugal. They ran the education system. They had vast amounts of property. A lot of their seminaries were not controlled by the laws of the civil government. Marriage was a Catholic institution. Now, there really was no quote-unquote separation of church and state. That's not to say that the Pope or the bishops might not agree all the time with their respective governments, but it was seen that they each had their role in the government. So you might have strong kings, but there were very often times when the Pope would have to put the king or the government in its place. The other thing I would say is that during this period prior to the mid-1800s, and I know you've discussed this on previous podcasts, the Pope was also a secular leader. He was the king, or King Pope, sometimes he was called, over the Papal States. Prior to about 1870, Italy was not a united nation. It was combined by, 10 or 15 different kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, and one of them was the Papal States. It wasn't the biggest, but it wasn't the smallest. And I think as you talked in the past, Steve, it extended from Rome on the west across the middle of Italy over to Ravenna. And the Pope was the king over that area. So he was also a secular leader. And then the other point is the New World had just been discovered in the late 1400s and had grown, particularly under some of these Catholic countries, France and Spain and Portugal. And so the world for the Pope was expanding, because as the conquistadors, etc., went into the American countries, they colonized them, and they often converted the natives in that area. So that the church was growing vastly, as did its wealth and as did the nations that they're part of. Now, there were some chinks in the armor, though. There was some cracks developing as far as the church was, and probably you could lump them under the concept of the Enlightenment over the late 16th century, going into the 17th century, and then into the 18th century. Rationalism under René Descartes, under Francis Bacon, Immanuel Kant, who was particularly kind of the father of the Enlightenment. They were now talking about freedom. They were talking about rationalism, and a lot of this was to the demise of the monarchies and of the papacies. And so you see the anti-monarch, anti-Christian, anti-Catholic ideologies, and they were often in the early 1700s in secret societies because they were considered, in many cases, traitors. They could be jailed, they could be exiled, they could even be executed for espousing these rationalistic, anti-monarch, anti-clerical positions. The popes in the 1700s, starting in about 1738, somewhere in that area, Clement XII, they started responding on what I call an ad hoc basis. They would attack some of these rationalistic thoughts. And I'm going to get into two of the main groups that the church attacked. But basically what the church did is they would attack that particular ideology, and then they would espouse a solution, and the solution was to believe in God, to believe in Christ, and to become a Catholic. It was kind of a two-step process. Now, the two main, quote-unquote, enemies of the church during this period of time that the encyclicals were being written now were Freemasonry and socialism. Now, I'm going to assume most of our listeners know what socialism is. It's a worker movement. Freemasonry, which I think probably a lot of people may not be as aware of, it's a fraternal organization. It was a secret society, continues to be a secret society. They trace their origins to the fraternities of stonemasons at the end of the 14th century. And they model themselves with their signs and symbols and secret handshakes, etc., after the stonemasons. They were organized in lodges, and then at the country level, starting in early 1700s in England, they had a Grand Lodge. So each country would have a Grand Lodge. They don't really, and I think even to this time, they don't really have an international organization, as socialism eventually had international organization. So what is wrong with Freemasonry as far as the Catholic Church at that time was concerned? And I might say too that the Catholic Church still does not consider a Freemason does not consider a person who is a Freemason to be a Catholic. So I'll read you here a quote from a later encyclical, which was from Pope Leo. But this is from his encyclical on Freemasonry in 1884. It just says, "The Freemasons, like the Manichees of old, strive as far as possible to conceal themselves and to admit no witnesses but their members. As a convenient matter of concealment, they assume the character of literary men and scholars associated with the purposes of learning." He goes on to say, "We have most clearly shown that which is their ultimate purpose forces itself into view, namely the utter overthrow of that whole religious and political order of the world, which the Christian teaching has produced, and the substitution of a new state of things in accordance with their ideas, of which the foundations and laws shall be drawn from mere naturalism." So the church at that time, and this goes before Pope Leo, but that's just an example. This is a continuation of the attacks on Freemasonry, was that with their rationalistic or naturalistic views, God was not considered as supreme. The reason was more prominent. They were less inclined to believe in miracles. They were less inclined to believe in a supreme being. many of the Freemasons might have a religion, but they did not think that it had to be the Catholic religion. They were particularly strong in Italy, so that created a problem for the popes, of course, since the church is based. So that's the ad hoc attacks before what I call the modern popes.
Where did the animosity come from, particularly with the Freemasons? Were the Freemasons against the church, or was the church against Freemasonry, or was it a mutual maybe distrust or conflict?
I think you could say it was mutual. The Freemasons did not necessarily, like I said, they were secret societies. As opposed to the socialists, they tended more to infiltrate the government, if you could call it that. I might go on to say that 14 of our U.S. presidents were Freemasons, starting off with George Washington and going through Gerald Ford. So, Freemasonry espoused the thoughts of democracy, separation of church and state, freedoms, and a lot of these things, given the status of the church at the time, in the 1700s and early 1800s to the middle of the 1800s, this was really an anti-church thing. So it was kind of a mutual thing. Now I might add, and just to bring this up to the modern popes and the idea of the encyclicals, but just to give you an idea, the secret societies then became revolutionaries. And I think everyone knows about, in 1789, the French Revolution swept away the monarchy, decapitated Louis XVI. Now, unfortunately, the revolution then ended up going from a monarchy to a dictator with Napoleon. Pope Pius VI in the 1790s, and then Pope Pius VII in the early 1800s. Both of them had the Papal States taken away by Napoleon because they opposed the French Revolution. Both of them were jailed by Napoleon. Pope Pius VII, actually, the only reason he got out of prison was because Napoleon was exiled in 1814 after the Battle of Waterloo. So, if you can imagine, the papacy had no use for this rationalistic movement and revolution. Now, revolutions continued. 1832, there was a revolution in France known as the June Rebellion. And then moving into 1848, there was a wave of revolutions across Europe. And these were knocking off a number of the monarchies, creating constitutional governments. A lot of people were killed, a lot of people were destroyed. Not all of the monarchies were knocked off, but a number of them were. But very importantly, Pope Pius IX, who began his papacy in 1846, he was exiled. He actually had to leave Italy because the wave of revolutionaries going across Italy. And he spent the better part of a year. I don't know if he went to Corsica or Sardinia, but he had to leave. He had to leave Italy because of this wave of revolutions going through Italy. He finally came back. He left probably as a moderate progressive, but when he came back, needless to say, he was a reactionary. And he wrote a number of encyclicals during this period of time against Freemasonry, socialism, rationalism, naturalism, whatever you want to call it. It culminated with two things. The first is he wrote an encyclical in, I believe it was 1864, called Quanta Cura, and it was really like the cover letter, the cover pages, to what's known as the Syllabus of Errors. The Syllabus of Errors was written by Pope Pius IX, and it listed 80 different isms and errors that the Catholic Church opposed. And it's kind of interesting to read at this point in time. I'll just give you an example. The first category of isms was pantheism, naturalism, and absolute rationalism. By that I mean, of course, there's no room for revelation. Everything has to be reasoned. The second category is moderate rationalism. So it's kind of interesting to look back just about 150 years ago or so, that rationalism was being attacked like it was by the church. The second thing that Pope Pius IX did, and maybe which he is known for, is he called Vatican I. Vatican I was it looks like both a hastily called and hastily adjourned Vatican Council. Now, what's interesting, during this period of time, the Vatican Council was called to do two things. Number one, to attack rationalism, and number two, to establish the infallibility of the Pope. and this was called in 1868. Now, ongoing at this period of time, and why I call it a hastily called council, is in the meantime, Victor Emmanuel II, who was the king of the Piedmont up in northwest Italy, along with his associates, were busy uniting all of these disparate duchies and kingdoms of Italy. And they were able to, along with Giuseppe Garibaldi, were able to unite all of these different little kingdoms into the nation of Italy, save one, and that was the Papal States. So this is during the period of time in which Vatican I is being called. Eventually, Victor Emmanuel comes in a one-day battle. I think only one person was killed during this battle. They take over the Papal States, and Pope Pius IX immediately, of course, excommunicates Victor Emmanuel and declares that he does not recognize the nation of Italy, and that, very importantly, he refuses to leave the Vatican. And he begins a series of popes that are known formally or informally as the prisoners of the Vatican.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. At this point, the papacy is starting to pile up enemies, you might say. That, like you said, there's all the isms. Maybe just quickly before we go too far into this, when you bring up the word socialism, especially this day, you probably have an equal measure of people who have very strong opinions on it one way or the other. What was the situation of the socialists at that time? And maybe just very briefly, where were they coming from and who were they?
Well, the socialists, like I said, began with the rationalism movement in the early 1700s as a secret society. They were really more of an ideology, workers of the world unite. They were saying that the monarchies, along with the Catholic Church, along with the other, dominant religions, were not, treating the working men right, and that the whole government had to be reorganized. This is different from the Freemasons, who are willing to work within the government. The revolutions occurred in 1789. That was really not a socialist revolution, as opposed to the revolutions that swept across 1848. There was very, very definitely tones of socialism there. By the 1840s, Karl Marx, of course, had written his first book. I think it was the Communist I can't remember if he wrote Communist Manifesto first or Das Kapital, but it was starting to get more organized. And by the late 1800s, and by that I mean 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, when Pope Leo XIII took over in 1878, they're now starting to form political parties. So almost every country in Europe had a socialist party. Sometimes they were called the Democratic Socialists, sometimes they were called the Social Democrats, sometimes they were called the Workers' Parties. But nearly every country had a party. And as we move on, they get stronger and stronger. So unlike the Freemasons that really never organized, political parties or at least outwardly advocated revolutions, the socialists were more interested in overthrowing the government.
So really, in summary, all these different groups had different conflict points with the church and with the papacy. The Kingdom of Italy, they're in direct conflict over what you might even say secular power, whereas with the different groups, maybe it's more cultural and other aspects. It's different powers. But so there is a lot of different fronts that the church is taking on. How is the church organized politically against these elements? Meaning, to get to us to the point, what were these encyclicals meant to do? Like, how were they meant to influence people?
These ideologies, well, initially, and probably as it goes forward, Europe had been united as a Christian country. So Germany was Christian, France was Christian, they were all Christian. When socialism came about, this started pitting within each country the different classes. So the working class became opposed to the nobles and the richer people, and it also started pitting different countries against each other. The Pope is supposed to be a global ruler, so the purpose of the encyclicals And like I was saying, at least prior to Pope Leo the 13th, it was the church really didn't make a very unified attack on these with a solution. So that's why I would call the encyclicals through Pope Pius IX up till 1878 kind of an ad hoc basis. On the other hand, when Pope Leo the 13th came in, he was more of an intellectual, I would say. Plus he was in the papacy for 25 years, from 1878 to 1903. He started writing encyclicals. In fact, the second encyclical out of 90 was on socialism, and he then started writing others that were more white papers, building a foundation on what was the solution. His most famous encyclical was written in 1891. It's known as Rerum Novarum, and I would encourage anyone who wants to read one of the more brilliantly written encyclicals to read Rerum Novarum. It comes from the Latin meaning of these newer things, or of the newer things. And I think what he meant when he was saying that, the newer things being socialism and rationalism. But as I read it now, the new thing was that his response was, not only was he attacking socialism, not only was he trying to tell everybody to come back to the Catholic Church, to believe in God, etc., but he was saying, he's trying to draw a line between socialism and capitalism. And for example, he was definitely against class warfare. This is one of the things that he was trying to say, that socialism was a specifically attack on, the rich versus the workers. He also wanted to draw a line in the sand. He was in favor of labor organizations. Of course, labor organizations should have a Christian basis. He said they should pay, and the owners of the businesses should pay a living wage, and they should be amenable to listening to the craft unions and to the various unions. He harkened back to being like the medieval guilds. But he also said that it was important for people to have private property. So he did oppose the socialistic concept that property was held in common, or property was held by the government. Same with the owners of production. He said this is something that should be done in a private way. So he tried to draw a line and say, we're not totally against capitalism, but there are some things that they can definitely improve on. We are against socialism, but there are some things that we can learn from them. And this Rerum Novarum, written in 1891, was really considered the first Catholic social justice teaching, and there were many more to come. There were many commemorations to Rerum Novarum over the years by the Pope.